Welcome back, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed your break. Welcome to those listening, watching at home. Without further ado, over to Colin for our next session.
It's good to be here again. Now, this second talk is the Poetic Cs Lewis. I felt that I wanted to talk about Lewis as a poet because it also impinges on all the kind of writing that he did. Even his academic writing had an element of a poetic nature or symbolic nature and so on, and it's part of who he was. And so I thought I would do a talk on the Poetic C.S. Lewis. Just to start with a quote from C.S. Lewis: "Poetry is a little incarnation giving body to what had been before invisible and inaudible." I'll try and speak up a bit. Yeah, if you do a little sign or something. Trouble is, I can't look at you while I'm. Yeah. This talk mentions C.S. Lewis's early ambition, which was to be an important poet, and his first book of poetry was published in 1919 when he was 20 and still recovering from war wounds. A long narrative poem, Geimer, appeared in 1926. Both reflected his atheism, or at least materialistic orientation of this period. It considers Lewis's distinct mark as a writer to have a poetic sensibility, a poetic way of seeing, fulfilled by and integral to his later religious convictions. This sensibility is most present in his prose fiction, but also is part of the attractiveness of his more academic style, whether writing literary history and criticism or philosophical theology. At its best, his poetic sensibility expresses itself in the making of myth. For him, great stories and myth have, like poetry, the ability to capture meaning and qualities in the details, and as such, he believed, appeal to an ideal human awareness that, though lost, we all remember. In fact, such stories, he felt, can give us actual sensations never before experienced. Effectively, they give us changes in consciousness. This ability to explore the cosmos, the cosmic, and the wide-ranging can also be through actual rather than fully imagined events. The epitome of such a connection of myth and fact was for Lewis the Word made flesh, the incarnation of God himself as a human being in the first century world. That incarnation for him was like the moments when stories and other products of the imagination, such as poems, hold together, quote, the general with the concrete. This is a quote from the poet Coleridge, the general with the concrete. Lewis's poetic sensibility can be illustrated by reference to books such as the Chronicles of Narnia, The Pilgrim's Regress, Till We Have Faces, Surprised by Joy, Out of the Silent Planet, and Perelandra, and as when the poet Ruth Pitters turned some of Lewis's prose naturally into verse. A great poet like Ruth Pitter recognized the hidden poetry in Lewis's prose. A poetic sensibility is fundamental basic to C.S. Lewis's writings, but there is a history and a development to it. As he once revealed in a letter, these are the words of Lewis himself. Sounds like I'm in the middle of a church service saying that. The imaginative man in me is older, more continuously operative, and in that sense more basic than either the religious writer or the critic. It is he who made me first attempt with little success to be a poet. It was he who, in response to the poetry of others, made me a critic. In defense of that response, sometimes a critical controversialist. Now back to my script. I don't pretend to be C.S. Lewis. A key point in this history is Lewis's dual conversion, first to theism in 1929, and then to Christian belief in 1931, in the second of which his close friend Tolkien, a devout Roman Catholic, played an important part. Tolkien placed his basic arguments in a poem addressed to the pre-Christian skeptical C.S. Lewis, entitled Mythopoeia, which means the making of myth. In this, he praises history's storytellers and mythmakers as vehicles of truth and hope about the universe and its creator. This is a few lines of it, of the long poem. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now and dark hath been, with light of suns as yet by no man's seen. I love those lines. Tolkien also spoke to Lewis of the New Testament gospel narratives. His argument persuaded Lewis that he needed to respond to them imaginatively, as he had done readily to Old Norse, Celtic, and classical mythology, as well as intellectually. The Gospels had all the qualities found in myth and great story, with the astounding unique factor that they record events which, in fact, happened in history. They are rooted in time and place. Lewis essentially drew Lewis into an old book, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, at a time when what he called the chronological snobbery, that's Lewis had called, his imbibing of the modernist myth of progress, had been deconstructed by another and mutual friend, that is Owen Barfield. Lewis had already realized that reading old books were necessary to counteract imbalances and distortions created by the modern view. Soon Tolkien and he would embark on projects to rehabilitate an older view. A striking and characteristic feature of the writings of that older and increasingly lost world, particularly prior to what Lewis came to see as the post-Christian West, was its embodiment of at least traces of an original unitary consciousness in the human being, an idea from Owen Barfield that captivated both Lewis and Tolkien. As someone who had had a very strong ambition to be a major poet before his conversions at the age of 31 and 33, Lewis recognized that with changes in consciousness leading to a characteristically modern mentality, the very nature of poetry had changed. In an essay on Edmund Spenser in 1954, this is what Lewis wrote. The general quality of the Fairy Queen is so highly poetic that it has earned Spenser the name of the poet's poet. But if we examine the texture of the language line by line, we may think that is sometimes flat and very little distinguished from that of prose. The truth is that Spenser belongs to an older school. In the earliest times, theology, science, history, fiction, singing, instrumental music, and dancing were all a single activity. Great. Love it. And Lewis continues, traces of this can still be found in Greek poetry. Then the different arts, which had once all been elements of poesis, developed and become more different from one another and drew apart. And this is in brackets. The enormous gains and losses of this process perhaps equal one another. That's the end of the brackets. Poetry became more and more unlike prose. It is now so unlike it that the number of those who can read it is hardly greater than the number of those who write it. Typical Lewis wit there. I'll go back to my script. It could be argued that C.S. Lewis also, as much as it is possible for a 20th century person, belonged to an older school, an older world, where his heart lay. His concerns with, as he put it, quote, symbolical or mythopoeic forms, end quote, in his writing was directly related to his conversion and his increasing preoccupation with an older consciousness, which was highlighted for him by the increasing separation of poetry and prose and dramatically spotlighted by modernism in poetry. Ruefully, he claimed, in his inaugural lecture upon taking up the new Cambridge Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature in 1954. And here's some more words of Lewis. I do not see how anyone can doubt that modern poetry is not only a greater novelty than any other, quote, new poetry, end quote, but new in a new way, almost in a new dimension. Lewis pointed out elsewhere the unprecedented difficulty of conceiving of evening, as T.S. Eliot wished his readers to, as a patient on an operating table. Lewis didn't like that at all, the idea of the operating table. Modern poetry sought originality, rejecting what he called, quote, stock responses, unquote, to experience. Rejecting, that is, a kind of decorum of the imagination. In the old view, goodness and truth were full of light. Evil and falsehood are a shadow world. Deity and worship are associated with height. Virtue is linked with loveliness. Love is constant and sweet. Death, bitter and enduring, praiseworthy. Death, bitter and endurance, praiseworthy. In my opinion, Lewis writes, quote, such deliberate organization is one of the first necessities of human life, and one of the main functions of art is to assist it. All that we describe as constancy in love or friendship, as loyalty in political life, or in general, as perseverance, all souled virtue and stable pleasure depends on organizing chosen attitudes and maintaining them against the eternal flux. Ending what Lewis is pointing out, and you can see how much it so influenced his own writing. Lewis employs such stock and archetypal symbolism in the Narnia Chronicles. For instance, the lush valley world of Narnia is an indicator of its spiritual health. It faces dangers from the north of cold, the White Witch, and from the south of Cheat, in the form of the warlike Calormenes. Calor, of course, is Latin for heat. This mappamundi echoes that of Lewis's first fiction, The Pilgrim's Regress, where its everyman, John, must stick to the straight central path to avoid the demonic dangers from north and south. The hazards embodied allegorically in that story pertain to Lewis's intellectual climate at the end of the 1920s and still have a great deal of relevance today. When Lewis's poetry is read, it often seems excessively modelled on older poetry, both in form and content, in times veering for some towards pastiche. To describe it, one needs the vocabulary of traditional rhymes and meters, such as rhyme royal, the Spenserian stanza, the alliterative meter, tetrameters, pentameters, iambs, and trochees. Don W. King, who's a literary scholar, spells out Lewis's, quote, lifelong fascination with prosody, end quote. In his study, C.S. Lewis, Poet, the legacy of his poetic impulse. The distinguished poet Ruth Pitter became a friend of C.S. Lewis, and though admiring some of his verse, recognized that his true poetry resided in his poetic prose, and struggled to articulate why this was so. She mused in her journal on their correspondence about each other's poetry. And this is what Ruth Pitter wrote. Did his great learning, a really staggering skill in verse, inhibit the poetry? He had a great stock of the makings of a poet, strong visual memory, strong recollections of childhood, desperately strong yearnings for lost paradise and hoped heaven, quote, sweet desire, unquote, not least a strong primitive intuition of the diabolical, not merely the horrific. In fact, his whole life was orientated and motivated by an almost uniquely persisting child sense of glory and of nightmare. The adult events were received into a medium still as pliable as wax, wide open to the glory and equally vulnerable, with a man's strength to feel it all, and a great scholar's and writer's skills to express and to interpret. It is almost as though the adult disciplines, notably the techniques of his verse, had largely inhibited his poetry, which is perhaps, after all, most evident in his prose. I think he wanted to be a poet more than anything. Time will show. But if it is magic he was after, he achieved this sufficiently elsewhere. Now that's very interesting what Ruth Pitter said. There is no doubt that Lewis is a significant, at least minor poet. His first volume of poetry was published in March 1919, when he was 20, much of it reflecting his experience in the First World War. He arrived at the trenches around his 19th birthday and was severely wounded a few months later by the shards of a shell that killed a friend standing beside him. In 1926, a long narrative poem, Daima, was published, which, like the earlier book, was shaped by unbelief in Christianity. Indeed, that rejected faith was limping together with all forms of supernaturalism, including spiritism, whereas the poem favored the form of this worldly philosophical idealism. This is a brief stanza from the long poem Daima. If I can say every word. Old theomagia, demonology, Kabbalah, chemic magic, Book of the Dead, damning hermetic roles that none may see, save the already damned. Such grubs are bred from minds that lose the spirit and seek instead for spirits in the dust of dead man's era, buying the joys of dream with dreamland terror. Soon after his conversion to Christian faith in 1931, Lewis turned to fiction that was fantasy, allegory, or parable. The symbolical or mythopoeic focus he mentioned in my earlier quotation. Less than 2 years later, in 1933, he published his contemporary take on John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Lewis's was The Pilgrim's Regress. A philosophical allegory of the modern zeitgeist, endued with themes that would prove to be characteristic of his writings, such as the quest for joy and a recognition of spiritual cosmic warfare between good and evil. His science fiction trilogy, the first volume of which was published in 1938, started as a wager with Tolkien to write fantasy for adults, rescuing it from being relegated simply to children's literature. A tossed coin between the two of them resulted in Lewis writing a tale of space travel and Tolkien of time. In the latter case, an effort which, though abandoned, did lead to The Lord of the Rings. Between the war years, a prolific period of publication for Lewis, he produced the best-selling The Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce, as well as the second and third in his science fiction series, Perelandra and That Hideous Strength. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe appeared in 1950, with the other Narnian Chronicles coming out annually until 1956. Also in 1956, Till We Have Faces appeared, a novel of great maturity which retells the myth of Cupid and Psyche as a precursor of the Christian gospel story, when for Lewis, myth became historical fact. It is into these books that Lewis most found expression for his, quote, poetic impulse, as Don W. King calls it. There is also, however, poetic prose embedded in more discursive works, such as essays and popular philosophical theology, like The Problem of Pain, Miracles, A Grief Observed, and Letters to Malcolm. King, in a major study of Lewis, poet believes. This is what Don King wrote. In A Grief Observed, Lewis works through his grief, in brackets, at losing his wife, Joy Davidman, in brackets, to a new understanding and a renewed faith. It is his free verse lament for joy, himself, and his understanding of God. And Don King continues, Perelandra and A Grief Observed suggests Lewis's propensity towards poetic prose. Other of Lewis's prose works, including Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, The Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, The Chronicles of Narnia, as well as others, demonstrate similar poetic elements, though not as extended nor marked as these. The thinking behind Lewis's symbolic and mythopoeic fiction was often shaped in the context of his friendship with Tolkien, and is greatly concerned with the art of narrative, the nature of story, the function of myth, and the foundational place metaphor has in our thinking and language, including in scientific theory and philosophical abstraction. As a writer, not merely a theorist and critic, Lewis had at the heart of his concern a desire to create meaning, to capture qualities or states in fiction. Such a desire resulted from and was accomplished by his poetic sensibility, what he called the fundamental, quote, imaginative man, end quote, in his makeup. Lewis, the imaginative man. Lewis champions the imagination as the organ of meaning, involving in all human knowledge of reality. For him, the imagination provides a sensing, perceiving, feeling knowledge that is objective but personal. A human faculty with metaphor is a condition of winning truth. Typically, Lewis states, quote, "A man who says heaven and thinks of the visible sky is pretty sure to mean more than the man who tells us that heaven is a state of mind." This is from an essay that Lewis wrote called Blussfels and Planispheres. It took me ages to be able to pronounce that, so I had to do it. Lewis held that elements of fantasy, fiction, and poetry are embedded simply by necessity in all human language and thinking. He distinguished reason and imagination, and truth and meaning. A concern he shared with Tolkien and other friends was to embody the qualitative, or what in thought is general and abstract, in literary, from while remaining the integrity and reality of these extra literary qualities. Tolkien, for instance, embodied the perilous journey and heroic quest in his The Lord of the Rings. Lewis made the quality of joy, or Sehnsucht, incarnate in his fiction, particularly in The Pilgrim's Regress, Till We Have Faces, and the Chronicles of Narnia, but also in his non-fiction, such as his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Such universal, archetypal, or symbolic elements in a successful narrative are rooted in the concrete and particular nature of the story or account. At times, a principle that appears contradictory or paradoxical as an abstraction, as is the relation of divine providence to free human agency, can work satisfactorily, organically, and integrally in a fictional narrative. In this, there was for Lewis and Tolkien a fascinating parallel with history. The most successful marriage of the general and the particular, they believed, being the incarnation of Christ, when myth became fact, as Lewis expressed it. In his book Planet Narnia, it's written by Michael Ward, reveals how the medieval world model that Lewis loved so much is incarnate in the 7 Narnian Chronicles. Ward argues that a particular astrological planet exists in each of the 7 as a quality or atmosphere. The sun, for instance, is particularly represented in the voyage of the Dawn Treader. The voyagers head east towards the sunrise. Gold, the metal of the sun, tempts Eustace and provides the curse on Deathwater Island. And light takes on a numinous quality as the adventurers approach World's End and Aslan's country. In achieving this correspondence, Lewis goes further than in his science fiction trilogy, which only flatly represents, further rather than in his science fiction trilogy, which only fully represents 2 of the planets, Mars and Venus, in its splendid re-envisioning of the medieval cosmos. In Out of the Silent Planet, as Ransom lay contemplating the stars, planets and galaxies through the spacecraft's window, he found it night by night more difficult to disbelief in old astrology. Almost, he felt, truly he imagined, quote, sweet influence pouring or even stabbing into his surrendered body. Don King observes that Perelandra, the second of the space trilogy, is the most poetic of all Lewis's prose writings. He demonstrated how the poet Ruth Pitter, with Lewis's approval, turned part of the concluding section of the book into Spensorian stanzas. This concerns the gods, whom Lewis has revealed as ruling angelic beings, using such a familiar category without losing their splendor and imaginative power over readers. Though the gods are difficult for human eyes to see, Ransom on the planet Perelandra, or Venus, as it is known to us, hears their voices and those of the new humans of that planet, speaking of the great dance of the universe. Ruth Pitter found the prose of this section of the book particularly conducive to poetry, as William Wordsworth before found with his sister Dorothy's journals, or recently Ruth Padell found with Charles Darwin's letters and other prose in her verse biography. Here is an example of Pitter's verse adaptation that Lewis especially praised. In this example, a voice speaks of a tree planted in Thulcandra, that's Earth, the silent planet, hearing fruit in the world of Perelandra with its new Adam and new Eve. And this is a paragraph from Lewis in Perelandra, his prose. The tree was planted in that world, but the fruit was ripened in this. The fountain that sprung with mingled blood and life in the dark world flows here with life only. We have passed the first cataracts, and from here onward the stream flows deep and turns in the direction of the sea. This is the morning star which he promised to those who conquer. This is the centre of worlds. Till now, all has waited, but now the trumpet has sounded and the army is on the move. Blessed be he. Now this is the stanza which Ruth Pitter created from that prose. Stanza 9. The tree was planted in that world, but here the ripened fruit hangs in the heaven high. Both blood and life run from the fountain there. Here it runs, life alone. We have passed by the first strong rapids. The deep waters ply on a new course towards the distant sea. Till now, all has but waited. In the sky there hangs the promised star, and piercingly the trumpet sounds. The army marches, blessed be he. Oh, it's good to hear a stanza from one of the leading poets of based on Lewis's prose in Perelandra. Now, as a conclusion, Lewis was clearly poetic, though some saw him as a minor poet. His work ranged from lyrics to long narrative poems, unfashionable to some. His early ambition had been to be a major poet. His first volume was published at the age of 21 after surviving his deep war wounds, but he found himself out of kilter with the modernist verse. He was disappointed much later by his failure to be elected as Oxford Poetry Professor of Poetry in 1951. So repeat there, sorry. Anyway, it's worth saying twice. In essence, however, Lewis's developing quest to embody poetic, symbolic, and at its height, mythopoeic meaning in his prose, took precedence over poetry in his post-conversion writing. Though he continued to write and to publish poems in periodicals such as Cambridge Review, The Spectator, Punch, the TLS, Time and Tide, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, he no longer integrated his work around an attempt to become established as a poet, even a major one. Instead, the quest to capture the real and the tangible as qualities or states attainable in imaginative writing possessed him. So much so that the reader's very experience could be enlarged. He wished to enact a necessarily limited kind of, quote, little incarnation, unquote, following the model of the ancient period when, he believed, myth became fact as a real historical moment in the 1st century and just before. In Perelandra, Lewis's fictional self in the story recalls a remark to Ransom after the return of the latter from Venus, concerning the difficulty of telling his story. And this is what is remarked to Ransom. I had incautionally said, of course I realize it's all rather too vague for you to put into words, when he took me up rather sharply for such a patient man by saying, on the contrary, it is words that are vague. The reason why the thing can't be expressed is that it's too definite for language. And this concept was very central to Lewis and also to Tolkien. Now, here is, now where's this text from? Oh yes, some poetry here from Tolkien that he wrote. It's a section that he wrote to Lewis. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced as he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His willed dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed, we make still by the law in which we're made. It's lovely to hear that section from Tolkien's long poem, which he wrote to C.S. Lewis after Tolkien had helped Lewis to come to Christian faith. Oh, bibliography. I won't read the bibliography, so I finished.
Once again, we have a little time for any questions. I've been asked if there are any, that I repeat them into the microphones so that those at home can hear them afresh. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Colin, I struggle with poetry, but I don't struggle with C.S. Lewis. I wonder if you could suggest books or articles which will put C.S. Lewis into poetry so that I can learn poetry.
If I can just repeat that first. Gentleman has said, love C.S. Lewis, not too keen on poetry, if I've got that right. Are there any articles or books that Colin could suggest which could help that transition?
Thank you. Well, I'll cheat a bit and say there's two poetic books by C.S. Lewis that I think you can they're still available. One is Lewis's poetry, and the other is his narrative poems. And they're both very different because the first are lyrics, whereas the narrative poems are, of course, stories. And actually, they're easier to read, the narrative poems, than the lyrical ones, because, as I said, Lewis, with his classical background, he makes wonderful use of the words he uses, but sometimes you need to know what the words mean. So maybe it's worth sorting it up as well. And what else could I suggest with in terms of Lewis's poetry? Well, there was a list which one was it? I can find it. There's certain books that are particularly poetic in their prose. I'll read the list again. Okay, just for you. Perilander, A Grief Observed, Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, The Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, The Chronicles of Narnia. Now, if you read that would be a wonderful treat for you. And there is that underlying poetic element. So it might be worth reading those. I'd like to read them again.
If I may just throw in a thought there, I've sometimes found it helpful to read some of Lewis's prose aloud. And in the reading aloud, somehow I hear the poetry a little bit more than when I'm reading silently. But I think there was a comment there.
Yes, just following on from that and connecting also with what you were saying. I struggle with poetry, but sometimes when you hear it, it's better to hear it. And it would be interesting to know if there were any recordings of Lewis's poetry. There was a wonderful series on this is 20 years ago, of Alan Bennett. I don't know if you've ever heard of Poetry in Motion. It's called Reading from 6 poets on Hardy and Louis and Bettina, who as well. And it was just wonderful to hear these poems read out loud.
So the question there for those at home, are there any recordings of Lewis's poetry being read out loud?
I don't know of any. I certainly would like to have copies. And with poetry, I very much like to hear it read, especially somebody who can read well. You need somebody. That's very helpful. And to, as you said, to read it yourself aloud. Or you might have somebody in the family who's good at, and you could record them reading it and take the recording away and listen to it whenever you want to.
I am just wondering if this should be a project for Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth, that we start reading some of the great poems and we record them and we make a bank of them. Just a thought. Any questions, any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
About poetry. Could you please tell me what is your favorite poem of Lewis and why it is so? How do you find it amazing or not boring? Why it's your favorite?
So, thank you. So the question for Colin now is, does he have a favorite C.S. Lewis poem? And if so, why? What makes it your favorite?
I meant to put it at the end of the, I've got it with me now. And it's a short poem. Lewis, one of Lewis's great friends throughout his whole life was called Arthur Greaves, who lived over the road from where he did. When I was fortunate enough to be able to go into Lewis's house when he was, the house that he lived in when he was young, the people let me in, and where Arthur Greaves lived was just opposite, and they became very, very fast friends throughout their lives. And he wrote, when he first got to know Arthur Greaves, he wrote this little poem, which I was trying to find desperately to have in my talk, and for somehow I've missed out the quotation at the end, and I haven't got it on my phone, on the screen. So I don't know how I can let you know really what.
I might have a quick look at over lunch, and if we can track it down, we shall bring it this afternoon.
Well, that'd be good. Good idea.
If I can ask a question now, this could be entirely wrong. I've heard rumours that one of the reasons why Lewis was denied the Professor of Poetryship in 1951 is that he wasn't terribly popular among some of his fellow academics. Is that true, or is that a mischievous rumour?
Well, it's hard to tell. Oh, sorry. Yeah, what I was going to say. I don't really know an answer to that because I wasn't there when Lewis was there. But there was bound to, in any university or college or there's bound to be some people some lecturers that annoy fellow lecturers and things like that. But there must have been some really good reason why, and perhaps they felt that he was being too successful, and it might do him good not to have it. I don't know, but Lewis, he was he was what's the term? He stood up for himself, and he was very confident. But at the same time, he was also, strangely, he was also humble. He had a mixture of that, and so I don't know the real reason. But in a way, I think that he wasn't one of the really great poets. And I think the professor of poetry should be one of the real top ones. And I think Lewis would understand that he wasn't the best one in the country, you know, and he wouldn't make him ill or grumble or anything like that, I don't think. He was basically a humble person, I think.
Thank you. Any other final questions from this session?
Just one thing. So you didn't get the job, so who did?
We've just been asked who got the job, the poetry job. I think it was F.R. Leavis.
Oh no.
But it wasn't.
No, I didn't say that.
But that's maybe something else I will need to look up over lunch. Yes, if I've got that completely wrong at home, don't go telling all your friends over lunch. So I may well have done.
You have to take it or leave us.
Question.
Driving on, last question for the comment. Lewis famously clashed with his modeling tutee John Benjamin later to become poet laureate.
We were reminded that Lewis clashed with his tutee John Betjeman later to become poet laureate. Betjeman is someone who reads his poems well, if I may say. I think there was a moment when Betjeman turned up wearing some slippers to a tutorial, and Betjeman said something like, "I hope you don't mind," and Lewis said, "I would mind wearing them very much," or something. I told that anecdote very wrong. Look up that over lunch as well.
The person who got the professorship was Paul Muldoon.
Oh, thank you. That saved me a job over lunch. It was Paul Muldoon. Thank you very much. You got the professorship.